Dawn arrived without ceremony. The horizon was a pale line between sea and sky, and the ocean below carried the slow, indifferent rhythm of war. Somewhere beyond that line, fleets moved with purpose, engines pushing steel through water that had already swallowed more men than anyone could count. Above those waters, aircraft crossed the sky in practiced patterns, at altitude, at distance, where doctrine said survival was possible. But one aircraft refused that logic. Instead of climbing to safety, the pilot eased his nose downward. The altimeter wound past numbers that were meant to protect him. 200 feet. 100. Then lower still. At 50 feet above the surface, the world changed character. The ocean stopped looking like water and began to resemble ground, flat, fast, and unforgiving. Every wave crest appeared like an obstacle. Every gust of wind felt like a shove toward the sea. At that height, there was no room for correction. No time to recover from hesitation. The aircraft was no longer flying over the ocean, it was racing along it. From the decks of enemy ships, the first sightings were confusing. Lookouts expected threats from above, where aircraft usually descended in visible arcs. But this shape approached differently, small, fast, and nearly swallowed by the horizon. Anti-aircraft crews hesitated, guns tracking higher angles out of habit. What they were seeing did not match the geometry of their training. This altitude was not part of any approved attack profile. It existed in the margins of manuals, in footnotes that warned against unnecessary risk. At 50 feet, there was no defensive maneuver worth attempting. A single burst of flak, a minor engine failure, a misjudged wave, and the aircraft would simply vanish, absorbed by the surface it was skimming. The pilot knew the math. He had read the same reports as everyone else. But statistics felt different when measured in seconds instead of percentages. At this height, distance disappeared quickly. Targets grew larger. The approach that doctrine dismissed as reckless suddenly felt direct, almost inevitable. Ahead, the enemy fleet widened across the horizon, unaware that the rules governing the attack had already been abandoned. The run had begun where doctrine ended, and somewhere far behind him, a written order was about to collide with the reality of what he was doing. Long before the aircraft skimmed the ocean at 50 feet, the decision had already been made on paper. It arrived not as a dramatic announcement, but as a formal directive, typed, reviewed, and distributed through the quiet machinery of naval command. The language was measured and precise. Low-altitude torpedo attacks were to be avoided. The risks were unacceptable. The projected losses were too high. In conference rooms far from the sound of engines, analysts studied charts and tables. They calculated approach distances, enemy gun arcs, and average reaction times. Every scenario pointed toward the same conclusion. At low altitude, the aircraft would be exposed for too long. Defensive fire would be too concentrated. Survival rates, they predicted, would collapse. The numbers were not emotional. They did not argue. They simply accumulated until the answer seemed inevitable. The tactic was labeled reckless. Some officers called it wasteful. Not because it lacked imagination, but because it consumed resources the Navy could not afford to lose. Aircraft were expensive. Pilots were irreplaceable. A doctrine that sacrificed both in pursuit of marginal gains was seen not as courage, but as miscalculation. In those calculations, survival and effectiveness were placed on opposite sides of a ledger. To increase one meant reducing the other. The safest approach was altitude and distance, long, stable runs where torpedoes could be released from predictable parameters. It was not glamorous, but it was orderly. And in wartime, order felt like control. Paper doctrine carried authority that individual instinct did not. Reports replaced anecdotes. Statistics overruled personal observation. The Navy believed that discipline was not just a virtue, but a form of protection. When everyone followed the same rules, chaos could be contained. So when a pilot proposed dropping lower, much lower, the response was cautious. He was not celebrated for his boldness. He was warned about his survival odds. Briefings emphasized the danger. training manuals reinforced the ban. The message was consistent: this was not the kind of innovation the Navy wanted. What he saw as an adjustment, the institution saw as a liability. Between the cockpit and the command desk, two kinds of logic were forming. One trusted the numbers. The other trusted what the numbers might be missing. And somewhere between those two positions, the first real test of the forbidden tactic was already taking shape. The engines held a steady roar as the aircraft flattened out just above the waves. At that height, there was no horizon in the usual sense, only a narrow strip of grey sky ahead and the endless motion of water beneath. Spray lifted in thin veils as the propeller's wash disturbed the surface. The aircraft's shadow skimmed across the ocean like a second, darker machine racing beside it. Then the fleet appeared. It did not arrive dramatically. It simply grew, shape by shape, until individual hulls could be distinguished. Steel towers, gun mounts, antennae, an entire formation spread across the water, confident in its spacing and its procedures. From altitude, the ships would have seemed orderly and distant. At 50 feet, they looked immense, almost immovable. Anti-aircraft guns began to move. Barrels lifted toward the sky, following instinct and training. Crews searched for targets above the ships, where aircraft usually appeared before their dives. Shells burst at higher altitudes, small black clouds forming where the gunners believed the threat should be. But the aircraft was not there. It was below their expectation, skimming through the empty layer of air their doctrine had left unguarded. The pilot held his line. There was no time for dramatic maneuvering. Only alignment, speed, and distance. The torpedo release came quickly, so quickly it felt premature, almost wrong. By traditional standards, it was an impossible drop. Too close. Too low. Too brief. The weapon struck the water and disappeared beneath the surface. Then another. And another. Each entry was quiet, almost delicate, as if the ocean were swallowing the evidence before anyone could react. Moments later, the first explosion lifted a column of water against a ship's hull. Then another followed, and another, spreading outward like ripples from a stone. Reports had no time to form. Damage travelled faster than information. One ship slowed, then listed. Flames crept along its deck. Another began to drift out of formation, smoke pouring upward in thick, unbroken lines. Confusion moved through the fleet more quickly than orders. Signals overlapped. Guns shifted direction. Officers searched for a threat that had already passed them. By the time command tried to understand what had happened, the engagement was nearly finished. The water carried the evidence: burning ships, drifting smoke, and the silence that follows a sudden collapse of certainty. And far from the battle, the assumptions that had once forbidden such an attack were about to face their first serious doubt. Before the war, naval aviation had been shaped by distance. Distance meant time. Distance meant order. At altitude, aircraft could approach with measured speed, adjust their course, and release weapons according to carefully rehearsed procedures. From 10,000 feet, the battlefield appeared manageable. Threats were visible. Reactions could be planned. Control, at least in theory, remained intact. Doctrine reflected that comfort. Training emphasized long approach runs and stable release parameters. Torpedoes were engineered with those expectations in mind. They were meant to enter the water from specific heights, at specific speeds, and at predictable angles. Their mechanisms were tuned to those conditions. To change the altitude was not simply to change the tactic, it was to challenge the engineering assumptions built into the weapon itself. Low-level attacks, when discussed at all, were associated with loss. The aircraft would be exposed for longer periods, closer to enemy guns, with fewer escape options. Calculations suggested that pilots attempting such approaches would face overwhelming defensive fire. In simulations and exercises, the results were consistent. Loss rates climbed sharply as altitude dropped. The numbers seemed clear enough to discourage further experimentation. Within command circles, discipline was considered the antidote to chaos. War, they believed, was already unpredictable. The only defense against that unpredictability was uniformity, shared procedures, standardized altitudes, identical attack profiles. If every pilot followed the same rules, outcomes could at least be estimated. Deviations threatened that fragile structure. So statistics began to carry more authority than individual experience. Reports, tables, and predictive models became the language of decision-making. A single pilot's observation, no matter how sharp, could not compete with columns of calculated loss percentages. Judgment, once shaped by intuition and field experience, was gradually replaced by numerical consensus. In that environment, innovation was not celebrated. It was treated as a form of deviation, and deviation implied disorder. A tactic that did not fit the established model was viewed less as an opportunity and more as a disruption. It threatened the logic that held the system together. Safety, in this sense, became synonymous with control. If procedures were followed, risk could be contained. If they were broken, chaos would follow. That was the belief, clear, rational, and difficult to argue against on paper. But far from the charts and calculations, the enemy was preparing for the kind of attack those papers had quietly ruled out. Across the Pacific, another navy built its own certainty. Japanese fleet defenses were not careless or unprepared. They were carefully structured, refined through exercises, and reinforced by early successes. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned according to threat models that had proven reliable. Lookouts were trained to scan the skies at specific angles. Fire control systems were calibrated for aircraft descending from altitude, not skimming the surface. Training followed those expectations. Gunners learned to track targets that appeared high above the formation, growing larger as they descended in predictable arcs. They practiced leading targets at known speeds, adjusting elevation and timing according to formulas drilled into memory. The threat was assumed to come from above, where aircraft were visible and their intentions could be read from their approach. Fleet formations reflected the same logic. Ships were arranged to provide overlapping fields of fire against vertical attacks. Defensive patterns were built upward, not outward. The sky was treated as the primary direction of danger. The waterline, by contrast, was considered a zone of relative safety. It was simply not where aircraft were expected to fight. Early victories reinforced that belief. Encounters at sea confirmed the effectiveness of their defensive routines. Aircraft that approached according to standard doctrine were met with disciplined fire. Losses mounted among attackers who followed the expected profiles. Each success added another layer of confidence. The system appeared to work exactly as intended. With repeated success came a quiet assumption surprise was unlikely. The enemy, they believed, would follow the same logic they did. After all, the physics of flight and the constraints of torpedo design seemed universal. There were only so many ways to conduct an attack, and all of them had been studied. Doctrine, in this way, began to narrow perception. It did not eliminate threats, it filtered them. Anything that fell outside established patterns was less likely to be noticed, and even less likely to be taken seriously. The fleet's defensive posture was strong, but it was also selective. It protected against the threats it understood. Certainty, once it hardened, became its own form of exposure. On the decks of those ships, gunners stood ready, eyes lifted toward the open sky. They were disciplined, experienced, and confident in their training. But their confidence was built on a single assumption that the attack would come from above. Somewhere beyond the horizon, aircraft were already descending toward a different approach, one that would not fit the angles their guns were trained to follow. Among the rows of aircraft and the repetition of training flights, one aviator developed a different habit. Where others studied success, clean approaches, textbook releases, and safe returns, he studied failure. He read reports where torpedoes missed. He looked at diagrams of aircraft shot down during long, exposed attack runs. To him, the patterns were clear, but the conclusions felt incomplete. The mathematics of doctrine said altitude meant safety. Higher approaches offered more time, more distance, more options. But the reports from the field told a different story. Aircraft flying those long, predictable paths were often cut apart by concentrated defensive fire. The calculations were precise, but they seemed to ignore the human element, the way ships actually reacted when threatened. He began to question the assumptions that training treated as unquestionable. Why was altitude always considered protection? Why did a longer approach automatically mean a safer one? He studied gun placements on ships, the arcs of their fire, the time it took for crews to identify and track a target. The numbers were there, but they suggested a different logic than the one doctrine embraced. From a certain angle, altitude was not protection at all. It was exposure stretched over time. A high approach made the aircraft visible earlier, trackable longer, and predictable in its path. The enemy did not need to guess where the aircraft would be, the geometry of the attack told them. Distance, once seen as safety, began to resemble vulnerability. Risk, he realized, might not be about how far away the aircraft stayed. It might be about how long it remained the target. A shorter, lower approach would offer less time for gunners to react. It would compress the window of danger into a narrow slice of seconds. The aircraft would be closer to the guns, but it would also be there for less time. The solution did not look elegant. It lacked the symmetry of doctrine or the neat lines of a training manual. It was rough, almost primitive, fly low, stay fast, release close. It required nerve more than theory, but it aligned with what he saw in the reports. It matched the way ships actually fought. In quiet conversations and informal trials, the certainty of established doctrine began to show its first cracks. The numbers had not changed, but the way one man read them had. And once a belief begins to fracture, it rarely breaks in silence. The first trials were not heroic. They were cautious, tense, and often discouraging. Aircraft descended to altitudes that felt unnatural, engines roaring just above the surface as waves slid past the cockpit canopy. At those heights, even calm water looked threatening. Every swell suggested a collision. Every gust of wind felt like a shove toward the sea. Pilots discovered quickly that the margin for error had nearly vanished. At 50 feet, there was no gentle correction. A slight misjudgment of altitude could drag a wingtip into the water. A moment of distraction could turn the aircraft into wreckage before the torpedo was even released. The trials were not battles, but they carried the same tension, machines and men operating at the edge of what felt survivable. For many crews, the real struggle was not mechanical. It was psychological. Training had taught them to climb, to gain altitude, to create space between themselves and danger. Now they were being asked to do the opposite. Instinct said pull up. The new tactic required them to stay low, to trust the surface rushing beneath them, and to believe that proximity could be a form of protection. The torpedoes themselves did not always cooperate. Designed for higher releases, they sometimes struck the water too hard, diving too deep or tumbling unpredictably. Some vanished beneath the surface, never to reappear. Others veered off course, their mechanisms confused by conditions they had never been meant to endure. Each failure seemed to confirm the warnings written in the manuals. But the trials continued. Failures were not announced widely. They were recorded in logs, noted in maintenance reports, and discussed quietly among pilots and mechanics. Each unsuccessful drop produced another adjustment, slight changes in release speed, altitude, or angle. The process was slow and unglamorous. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, only gradual improvements. With every attempt, the fear became slightly more familiar. The aircraft still felt too close to the water, but the pilots began to understand how it behaved at that height. The torpedoes still misbehaved, but patterns started to emerge. What had once seemed impossible began to feel merely difficult. Progress did not arrive with applause. It emerged quietly through the steady erosion of doubt. And somewhere in those unpublicized trials, the forbidden tactic began to resemble a workable one. The first solution did not come from a grand design office or an official directive. It began in workshops, on maintenance decks, and beside aircraft that still smelled of salt and fuel. Mechanics studied the torpedoes with the same attention pilots gave the sea. They were not trying to redesign the weapon entirely. They were trying to make it behave differently in a very specific moment, those first few seconds after it struck the water. The problem was depth. Dropped from low altitude, the torpedoes tended to dive too steeply, disappearing beneath the surface before leveling out. Some struck the seabed in shallow waters. Others lost stability and wandered off course. The weapon was not failing out of weakness, it was following instructions written into its design. Those instructions simply no longer matched the new conditions. So the adjustments began. Wooden fins were attached to stabilize the entry angle. Release mechanisms were tweaked to soften the drop. Small, careful modifications aimed to reduce the depth of the initial dive. None of these changes were dramatic. They were practical, almost improvised, solutions born from observation rather than theory. Official manuals did not change overnight. Instead, release parameters were rewritten quietly, passed from one crew to another in briefings and handwritten notes. Pilots were told to approach at specific speeds, at exact altitudes, within narrow margins. The numbers were not part of doctrine yet. They were part of a growing understanding, shaped by trial and error. Mechanics and pilots began to work more closely than regulations usually encouraged. The boundary between cockpit and workshop blurred. A pilot would describe how a torpedo behaved on impact, and a mechanic would adjust the stabilizers accordingly. Each flight became part of an ongoing conversation between man and machine. In the cockpit, the changes demanded a different kind of discipline. Pilots had to retrain their instincts. Instead of long, cautious approaches, they practiced brief, precise runs. Muscle memory adjusted slowly. Altitude was no longer something to gain, but something to hold steady, unwavering, and dangerously close to the water. With repetition, the risk began to feel more manageable. Not safe, but controlled. The torpedoes entered the water with less violence. Their parts grew more predictable. The approach, once considered reckless, started to show consistency. What had been forbidden on paper was becoming functional in practice. The tactic still lacked official approval, but it no longer lacked results. And somewhere beyond the workshops and test flights, the war was moving quickly enough that theory would soon have to meet reality. Despite the quiet improvements, official endorsement never arrived. The directive remained unchanged, its language still clear and cautious. Low-altitude torpedo attacks were discouraged. The projected losses were too high. Command had studied the reports, but the weight of doctrine was not easily shifted. Numbers on paper still argued against the tactic, and institutions tend to trust their own conclusions. So the pilots continued their preparations in a strange space between approval and prohibition. The method worked in trials. The torpedoes behaved better. The approach felt more controlled with each repetition. Yet the official stance remained unmoved, as if the war itself were waiting for paperwork to catch up. But war rarely waits for permission. Intelligence began to filter through command channels, fragmented at first, then more precise. Reconnaissance aircraft reported a concentration of enemy ships moving in predictable patterns. The formation was dense, its spacing tight enough to suggest confidence. It was the kind of target naval aviators were trained to dream about, and the kind of opportunity that did not linger. Analysts plotted the fleet's projected course. Timing mattered. Distance mattered. And then the weather report arrived. Low cloud cover. Reduced visibility. Conditions that would complicate high-altitude attacks, but favor a low approach. The sky itself seemed to tilt the odds toward the forbidden tactic. The moment was forming faster than doctrine could react. There was no dramatic confrontation with command. No heated argument or defiant speech. The decision emerged quietly, almost inevitably, from the circumstances themselves. The tactic existed. The opportunity existed. And the war did not offer many second chances. Briefings were concise. Crews listened without unnecessary questions. They understood the risk. Some had flown the low runs during trials. They knew how close the ocean would feel beneath their wings. They knew how little time there would be for correction. More importantly, they knew the tactic still carried the weight of disapproval from above. But combat had a way of simplifying decisions. Orders were orders. Targets were targets. And once the aircraft left the deck, doctrine mattered less than execution. In the ready rooms, there was no talk of innovation or history. Only headings, speeds, release distances. The language of survival. Each crew accepted the possibility that they might not return. The decision to fly low had already been made long before the engine started. On the flight deck, propellers began to turn. The sound spread across the carrier like a rising tide. One by one, aircraft rolled forward, gathered speed, and lifted into the morning air. They climbed just enough to clear the waves, and then leveled off, disappearing into the low horizon where sea and sky met without ceremony. Somewhere ahead, an enemy fleet continued its course, unaware that the conditions it trusted were about to become its greatest weakness. The aircraft approached at an altitude that instruments barely acknowledged. Radar screens, calibrated for higher threats, offered only faint, uncertain returns. On the decks of the ships below, lookouts scanned the sky as they had been trained, eyes lifted, searching for silhouettes descending from altitude. The threat was expected to come from above, announced by shape and shadow. Instead, it arrived from the horizon. Aircraft slipped forward just above the water line, their profiles flattened by distance and glare. At that height, they seemed smaller than they were, almost harmless. For a moment, the fleet's defensive systems struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Guns began to turn, but instinct carried them upward. Barrels lifted toward the sky, tracking empty space where the threat was supposed to be. The first bursts of anti-aircraft fire bloomed harmlessly overhead. Shells detonated at altitudes that no longer mattered. The aircraft, still low and fast, passed beneath those explosions, engine steady, wings nearly brushing the surface. There was no time for dramatic maneuvering. Each pilot followed a narrow corridor of air between sea and steel. Targets grew larger in the windscreen, their hulls filling the frame. Release distances shrank from the long, measured runs of doctrine to brief, decisive moments. When the torpedoes dropped, they struck the water with a restrained, almost gentle entry. Then came the first impact. A column of water lifted against the side of a ship, rising higher than the deck guns. The explosion was not loud at first, just a dull, contained force beneath the surface. But the effect was immediate. The shock wave traveled through the hull, twisting metal and rupturing compartments. Propulsion systems faltered. The ship's forward motion slowed, then stuttered into uneven movement. Within seconds, smoke began to rise. Fire spread across the deck where fuel lines and electrical systems had been torn open by the blast. Damage control teams moved quickly, but the pace of destruction outstripped their procedures. What had been a single, stable vessel moments before was now two conflicting realities, one above the water line, still intact, and another below, already failing. On nearby ships, confusion began to replace coordination. Signals overlapped. Orders were repeated, then contradicted. Officers tried to identify the direction of the attack, but the geometry no longer made sense. The threat had not followed the expected path. It had appeared too low, too fast, and too close. By the time gunners adjusted their aim downward, the aircraft were already passing through the formation, preparing for their next runs. The first ship was slowing, smoke drifting across the water. Its position in the formation began to distort the fleet's alignment. One ship had taken the blow, but the structure of the fleet was already beginning to split around it. And the next wave of torpedoes was already on its way. The first impact was not an isolated event. It was a signal. As the damaged ship slowed and smoke climbed into the air, the next wave of aircraft was already entering the formation. They followed the same low approach, engine steady, wings skimming just above the surface. The runs overlapped with deliberate precision. There was no pause between attacks, no clear moment for the fleet to reorganize. Each aircraft arrived as the confusion from the previous strike was still unfolding. Commanders aboard the ships tried to regain a sense of order. Signals were sent. Formation adjustments were proposed. But the geometry of the engagement had changed too quickly. The threat did not appear from a single direction. It came from multiple angles at nearly the same altitude, each aircraft moving along the same narrow band of air just above the waves. Situational awareness began to dissolve. Radar returns were inconsistent. Visual reports conflicted. Officers spoke of aircraft to port, then to starboard, then directly ahead. The battle no longer followed a predictable sequence. It was a series of short, violent interruptions, each one altering the shape of the fleet before the last could be fully understood. Below decks, damage control teams worked with discipline and urgency. Bulkheads were sealed. Pumps were activated. Fire crews moved through smoke-filled corridors. But the pace of destruction outstripped their procedures. One explosion might have been contained. Two could be managed with coordination. But the strikes came too quickly in too many places for any single plan to hold. Another torpedo struck. Then another. Ships that had been intact minutes earlier began to list, their movement through the water turning uneven and uncertain. Engines faltered. Rudders locked. Formations loosened as vessels slowed or veered out of line. The fleet, once arranged in orderly geometry, began to fragment into drifting shapes. Smoke spread across the surface, thick and persistent. It climbed into the air, then drifted sideways, obscuring signal flags and blinking lights. Commands that once moved clearly from ship to ship were now swallowed by haze. Coordination depended on visibility, and visibility was disappearing. Losses mounted faster than comprehension. Reports of damage arrived in fragments, one ship burning, another slowing, a third unable to steer. By the time officers began to assemble a full picture, the situation had already changed again. The fleet was no longer a unified force. It was a collection of wounded vessels, each fighting its own emergency. 15 minutes earlier, the formation had been intact and confident. Now, 8 ships were damaged or burning, their position scattered across the water. The attack had not unfolded as a single, dramatic clash. It had come in compressed, relentless bursts, too fast for doctrine, too fast for adjustment. And as suddenly as it had begun, the engagement was ending. The aircraft pulled away, leaving smoke, fire, and silence behind them. What remained on the water was not just damage, but a realization that the rules governing the battle had changed in less than a quarter of an hour. The first reports arrived as fragments. Signals from returning aircraft. Brief radio summaries. Numbers without context. At first, command officers assumed they were incomplete, perhaps even exaggerated. Early battle reports often carried confusion with them. Details sharpened later, after debriefings and cross-checks. But the numbers did not soften with time. They hardened. Aircraft losses were lower than expected. Enemy damage was higher. The ratio, once calculated with careful pessimism, now stood inverted. Ships that had been considered secure under standard defensive doctrine were suddenly listed as disabled or burning. The reports did not match the predictions. They contradicted them. Analysts gathered again around their charts, but this time the calculations felt less certain. The equations had not changed. The defensive gun arcs were still valid. The reaction times were still measured. But the outcome had slipped through the margins those models allowed. Something about the assumptions themselves had proven incomplete. Debriefings from returning crews added another layer of clarity. Pilots described anti-aircraft fire bursting above them, tracking altitudes they never reached. They spoke of approach windows so brief that gunners had no time to correct their aim. Mechanics confirmed that the modified torpedoes had behaved more consistently than expected. The results were not accidental. They were systematic. The conversation inside command began to shift. What had been labeled as reckless was now being examined as effective. Risk, once measured only in projected losses, was now seen in relation to outcomes. A tactic that produced decisive results with manageable losses could no longer be dismissed as wasteful. It demanded reconsideration. There was no dramatic reversal. No public announcement declaring the doctrine wrong. Instead, the tone of internal discussion simply changed. Criticism faded. Questions replaced it. Officers who had once warned against the tactic now asked how it might be refined. The language of prohibition softened into the language of adjustment. Silence replaced the earlier resistance. The directive banning low-altitude attacks was not ceremonially repealed. It simply stopped being enforced with the same certainty. Training officers began to include the new approach in briefings. Maintenance crews were instructed to prepare torpedoes according to the modified parameters. The tactic moved quietly from the margins into the center of planning. Innovation, once viewed as deviation, was retroactively approved not as a rebellion, but as a lesson. In the official record, the shift appeared gradual and almost inevitable. But behind the paperwork, the truth was simpler. A tactic had been forbidden. Then it had worked. And the Navy, like all institutions at war, had learned to trust results more than predictions. The results of the attack did not remain confined to a single report or a single battle. They traveled through the Navy the way useful ideas always do, quietly at first, then with growing authority. Briefings began to include references to the low-level approach. Instructors spoke of it not as an experiment, but as a proven method. What had once been forbidden now appeared in training discussions as a practical alternative. Low-level attack doctrine spread with surprising speed. Pilots who had never met the original aviator were taught the same approach he had once been warned against. They practiced runs at lower altitudes, learning to trust speed and proximity instead of distance. The tactic no longer felt like an exception. It became part of the expected repertoire. Training manuals began to change. The language shifted from caution to instruction. Diagrams were redrawn to show shorter approach paths. Release parameters were adjusted to reflect the new conditions. The tone of the manuals remained calm and technical, but the implications were profound. An entire generation of pilots would now be trained according to lessons that had once existed only in private trials and unofficial modifications. Torpedo design followed the same evolution. Engineers studied the results of the low-level attacks and incorporated those lessons into new models. Stabilizing fins were no longer improvised additions, they became standard features. Depth controls were recalibrated. Entry angles were reconsidered. The weapon itself adapted to the tactic, turning what had once been a workaround into a permanent capability. The enemy, in turn, was forced to respond. Defensive gunners adjusted their training. Gun mounts were recalibrated to account for threats at lower altitudes. Lookouts were instructed to watch the horizon more carefully. The geometry of defense expanded downward, acknowledging a dimension that doctrine had once ignored. The fleet's confidence did not disappear, but it became more cautious, more aware of possibilities that had previously seemed unlikely. Inside the Navy, a quieter transformation was taking place. The lesson of the attack was not only technical. It was institutional. Officers began to recognize that flexibility could be a strength rather than a liability. Doctrine, they realized, worked best when it allowed room for adjustment. A rigid system might feel safe, but it could also become blind to new realities. Individual insight, once overshadowed by statistics, began to carry more weight. The story of the pilot who questioned the math circulated through ready rooms and briefing halls. It was not told as a tale of rebellion, but as a reminder. Sometimes the field saw what the charts could not. Sometimes the numbers needed to be read differently. Over time, the tactic lost its sense of novelty. It became routine. Pilots trained for it. Mechanics prepared for it. Commanders planned around it. The idea that once felt dangerous and unofficial settled into the structure of naval warfare, absorbed into the larger rhythm of the conflict. War has a way of collecting such lessons. It takes isolated experiments, individual decisions, and unexpected outcomes, and folds them into doctrine. What begins as an exception becomes a principle. What begins as a risk becomes a standard. And somewhere within those revised manuals and redesigned weapons, the memory of a single low flight over the water continued to shape how the war was fought. Recognition came, but it did not arrive with the drama one might expect. There were no parades for a tactic that had once been considered reckless. No speeches that admitted how close the idea had come to being dismissed entirely. The pilot's contribution was noted, recorded in reports, and eventually acknowledged within the structure of the service. But the tone was restrained, almost careful. Institutions rarely celebrate the moments when their certainty was proven incomplete. What people remembered most was the risk. Not the restraint it required, not the patience of the trials, but the danger of the approach itself. Stories circulated about aircraft skimming the waves, about engines roaring just above the surface, about how little room there had been for error. The image of the low run became fixed in memory, not as a calculation, but as a gamble that happened to succeed. Innovation, even when it worked, remained uncomfortable. It forced organizations to admit that the answers they trusted were not always sufficient. It introduced doubt into systems built on confidence. Commanders might adopt the new tactic, but few of them forgot how strongly it had once been opposed. The lesson was absorbed, but not without hesitation. Success did not erase the danger that had always been present. Low-level attacks were still unforgiving. The margin for error remained narrow. Pilots who flew the new profiles understood that the tactic demanded precision every time. A moment's inattention, a slight miscalculation, or an unexpected wave could still turn a successful approach into a fatal one. The method had proven effective, but it had never become safe. Those who survived the early trials carried memories that did not appear in official summaries. They remembered the tension of those first flights, the quiet failures, the torpedoes that dove too deep, the aircraft that never returned. They remembered the briefings where the tactic was discouraged, the subtle warnings that followed them into the cockpit. Their success was real, but so was the uncertainty that had surrounded it. Doctrine, by its nature, rarely honors doubt. It prefers clarity, clean lines, and firm conclusions. The story of the low-level attack did not fit neatly into that structure. It was born from hesitation, shaped by unofficial adjustments, and proven in a moment that could easily have ended differently. The manuals that followed spoke of parameters and procedures, but they did not capture the uncertainty that had preceded them. Progress, as it turned out, did not move in a straight line. It advanced in uneven steps, through trial, error, resistance, and eventual acceptance. The tactic that became standard had once been an outlier, sustained only by the persistence of those who believed the numbers might be read another way. By the time the war moved on and new aircraft filled the skies, the low-level approach felt ordinary. New pilots trained for it without questioning its origin. They inherited the tactic as part of the system, not as a challenge to it. And in that quiet transition, from forbidden idea to accepted procedure, the memory of how close it had come to being abandoned began to fade. In the years that followed, the tactic lost its sense of controversy. New pilots entered training programs that already included the low-level approach as part of standard instruction. They practiced the same 50-foot runs over open water, learning the precise speeds and release distances as if they had always existed. To them, it was not an innovation. It was simply the way the attack was done. The earlier resistance faded into the background. Manuals were updated, procedures refined, and the language of prohibition quietly disappeared. There were no footnotes describing the debates that had once surrounded the tactic, no extended explanations of the warnings that had filled the first briefings. The system had adjusted, and once it had adjusted, it moved forward without looking back. History has a way of recording outcomes while forgetting hesitation. Reports preserved the results of the engagement, the ships damaged, the timing of the attack, the effectiveness of the approach. But the uncertainty that preceded it rarely appeared in those summaries. The quiet arguments, the unofficial trials, the sense that the idea might be wrong, all of that lived mostly in memory, not in official text. The 50-foot run became an accepted truth. Pilots trusted it because they were taught to trust it. Commanders planned around it because experience had validated it. Engineers designed weapons to match it. What had once existed outside the boundaries of doctrine now formed part of its foundation. In that transition, something subtle occurred. The tactic lost its identity as a challenge. It became an expectation. New aviators were no longer told that the approach was risky or controversial. They were told it was effective. The idea that it had once been forbidden seemed distant, almost irrelevant. War often rewards those who see differently first. Not because they are braver or more reckless, but because they are willing to question assumptions that others accept as fixed. The pilot who studied the numbers had not tried to defy the Navy. He had simply read the same data and reached a different conclusion. Where others saw exposure, he saw opportunity compressed into seconds. His insight did not arrive as a grand theory. It came as a practical adjustment, a change in altitude, a shift in timing. But in war, small adjustments can reshape entire outcomes. A difference of a few hundred feet had turned defensive confidence into confusion. A tactic dismissed on paper had rewritten the engagement in 15 minutes. Later generations would inherit the method without inheriting the doubt that created it. They would fly low because the manuals told them to, not because they had questioned the assumptions themselves. The lesson would remain, but its origin would grow quieter with time. In the official record, the story was simple: the low-level attack had succeeded. Doctrine had evolved. The war had moved on. But beneath that simplicity was a more complicated truth. For a time, the tactic had been forbidden. It had been measured, doubted, and nearly discarded. And then, in the space of 15 minutes, reality had forced a reconsideration. They forbade his attack until 15 minutes proved them wrong.